Welcome back, first year students. So, previously we did half of the poem, Shadwell by John Dryden. So, let us continue with the poem. So, let us revise the last stanza which we did. So, the king of nonsense poetry, Mac Flecknoe, cried it is resolved. He cried with joy that the matter has been resolved, and he has decided in his mind that who will become the king after his death. And he chooses Shadwell because the reason he gives is that Shadwell alone bears my perfect image, and he has two qualities: that he can wage a war against the enemy, wit, and he can reign and he can rule the kingdom. And he says that he is mature in dullness from his tender years. The rest to some faint meaning make pretence, but Shadwell never deviates into sense. Very pungent satire on the nonsense poetry by Shadwell. He says, rest means other nonsense poets, other poets who write nonsense poetry, they make pretense. Pretense means at least they pretend that their poetry is meaningful. Rest to some faint. Now, notice the use of word faint means very light. Faint meaning make pretense means even their poetry does not contain any meaning, but they pretend that there is hidden meaning in their poetry. But Shadwell never deviates into sense. But Shadwell walks on the right path of nonsense poetry, and he never deviates into sense. Means he is consistent in writing nonsense poetry. Some beams of wit on other souls may fall, strike through and make a lucid interval. On other souls means other nonsense poets. Some beams means some rays of knowledge can be seen, some rays of meaning can be seen in other nonsense poets, but and strike through means some rays of wit and knowledge make entry through the minds of other nonsense poets and make a lucid interval means and stay till a certain period of time. He wants to say that other nonsense poets sometime even they write some sensible poetry, but Shadwell's genuine knight admits no ray. But the sincere knight in the mind of Shadwell admits no ray. Means he has the board of no entry for the ray of knowledge in his mind. His rising fogs prevail upon the day. Now, there is no day in the mind of Shadwell because there are fogs. Fog of ignorance, fog of nonsense poetry. So he says, Shadwell's genuine knight admit no ray. There is no ray of knowledge, there is no ray of meaning in the poetry of Shadwell. And that is the night. And what happens during the day? Even when sun comes, there are fogs prevailing. Means everywhere in his poetry we can find the absence of wit and wisdom, the absence of knowledge, or the absence of sensible things. Besides, his goodly fabric fills the eye. He say that he is such a big fat person that whenever we look at him, he looks like a monarch. There is face validity in his outer personality. His goodly fabric. The fabric means his body. Why is body called a fabric? Because body is the cloth of soul. So he says his body is so large and fat that it fills the eye. He looks king-like and seems designed for thoughtless majesty. His body seems to be fit, seems to be designed for becoming a king, and the king of thoughtless kingdom, thoughtless majesty. thoughtless as monarch oaks that shade the plain. Now, here he gives a very good simile and he compares the king with oak. Oak is considered to be a monarch tree because it covers a large area. In the same way, Shadwell's personality, physical personality, covers a large area and shade the plain. As the monarch oak tree, it covers a large area and it admits no ray of sunlight beneath it. In the same way, the shade of Shadwell, it allows no ray from the kingdom of knowledge and spread in solemn state supinely reign. So as the oak tree is spread in a large area and it reigns, it rules. In the same way, he is a big fat man and his poetry is nonsense poetry. Haywood and Shirley were but types of thee, thou last great prophet of tautology. Now he says that other nonsense poets, Haywood and Shirley, were just your types. They were not complete nonsense poet as you. So again, here is a very pungent and very sharp satire on the poetry of Shadwell. And he compares other two poets, Haywood and Shirley, with Shadwell, but he says that they were just your types, means they were just your followers, but you are the real king or the crown prince of the kingdom of nonsense poetry. Thou last great prophet of tautology. Nobody was like you and nobody will be like you. Thou means you are the last great prophet of tautology. Tautology means one who shows off in his poems, one whose poetry is devoid of sense. So, let us revise this poem. The poem starts with universal truth, and he says that all human beings are subject to decay. What does he want to say? He wants to say that all human beings will die someday, and when fate calls, even the kings must obey the call of death. So this was found. This means this universal truth was found by Flecknoe, like Augustus. Augustus also called a meeting in order to settle the succession of the state. State means kingdom. In the same way, Flecknoe, who was the king of the kingdom of nonsense poetry, he also called a meeting, important meeting, in order to choose or elect the crown prince. So, Young, who like Augustus Young was called to empire and had governed long. Now, both these kings, the actual king Augustus and the king of the kingdom of nonsense poetry, was called to kingdom in a very young age, in teenage. So naturally, till their old age, they had governed the kingdom for a long period of time. And this Flecknoe, this king of nonsense poetry, he was owned to be the absolute king in the kingdom of prose and in the kingdom of verse. It means that in the realm of prose, nobody was as nonsense, nobody wrote as nonsense poetry as Flecknoe, and nobody wrote as nonsense prose as Flecknoe. So, now the king has become old, flourishing in peace, and he has got a lot of children. As the kings used to have a lot of queens and a lot of princes, in the same way, he had a lot of other poets who were also writing nonsense poetry. And this king, this Flecknoe, who is now worn out with business because he has become old, and did at length debate to settle the succession of the state. He called all his ministers in order to discuss upon this serious matter of the appointment of crown prince, of appointment of successor. And they all started discussing, and they were having a deep thought over the matter. Now, he was looking for two qualities in his crown prince. Now, generally, what does a king looks for? Look for? He looks for two qualities. One, that the prince should be able to rule the kingdom, and secondly, that he should be able to wage a war against enemies. And who is the enemy here? The enemy is wit and knowledge and sense. Now the king was happy because he has made his decision, and he says that it is resolved. I have made my decision who should be my crown prince, because he says that nature pleads. Even it is a request from nature that he should be appointed the crown prince who resembles the king most. So he says that I have resolved that out of all my princes, only Shadwell he bears my perfect image. I can see my own image in my son Shadwell. Why? Because he is mature in dullness from his tender years. As I was made the king in my tender years, in the same way Shadwell also contains maturity in dullness from his tender years. Now notice the touch of humor, and also notice satire, pungent satire against the nonsense poetry of Shadwell. Now he says that Shadwell alone from all my sons, from my so many sons, I choose only Shadwell because he is confirmed in full stupidity. Now this is the kingdom of nonsense poetry, this is the kingdom of stupidity. So I will choose only that son who is confirmed. Confirmed means there is no doubt about his stupidity. And he gives us reason why he is rejecting his other sons. Why? Because the other sons, other princes, and the other nonsense poets, they pretend to have meaning in their poetry. At least there is pretense that their poetry is filled with certain meaning, and sometimes their poems show some sort of meaning and sense. But Shadwell's genuine knight admits no race. Shadwell is so genuinely witless and nonsense poet that he admits no ray of knowledge in his poetry. And his prevailing fogs prevail upon the day. Fog means clouds of ignorance. So he says that even his body shows that he is fit to become a king, because he is a fat and stout person, and like the oak tree, he covers a large area on this earth. And Hayward and Shirley, the other nonsense poets, were just his types. Even they can't copy, even they can't compete with the nonsense poetry of Shadwell. So he says that you are the last great prophet of tautology. Showing off. He says nobody was like you and nobody can be like you. So I hope you understood this poem, and I ask you to please notice the undertones of satire in this poem, and also notice the touch of humor in this poem. Thank you.